The first thing I noticed wasn't the white tablecloths or the chandelier glow. It was the way their laughter rolled across the room when they saw the logo on my work shirt, as if a uniform could tally a person's worth. I sat down anyway, choosing my breath over my pride, and the waiter leaned close with a voice soft enough to be mistaken for kindness. "Mrs. Simmers, the car service just checked in. Shall I let them know you'll be a few minutes?" Knives stopped moving, glasses paused halfway to lips, and every head tilted toward me like weather vanes in a sudden wind. I didn't answer right away. Silence, I've learned, can be louder than defense. In that pause, I watched them try to fit me back into the box they preferred, the one labeled almost, but not quite. I lifted my water, took a slow sip, and let the room sit with the version of me they hadn't bothered to ask about. Before I tell you what followed, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and if stories of quiet justice and hard-won dignity speak to you. Tap subscribe so more of us can find each other. My name is Taylor, and I wasn't raised to make scenes. I was raised to make sense of spreadsheets at the dinner table of report cards laid out like stock tickers of the way praise flowed wherever titles did. We were a Midwestern family with nice manners and sharper metrics, the kind that treated holidays like performance reviews with better desserts. I learned early that approval arrived in numbers: GPAs 401, KS, square footage miles per gallon. When I chose a different lane, contract work that grew into a one-woman branding consultancy, no one said I'd failed. They just called it brave, in that careful tone people use when they expect you to fall. I smiled and built anyway, because some things are easier to carry than the weight of pretending. The truth is, I like small things that matter. A coffee shop's first sign that makes a stranger walk in a nonprofit's color palette that feels like hope instead of homework. A tagline that sounds like someone finally being heard. My days started before the sun with black coffee and playlists that made tight budgets feel like possibility. And I spent them meeting shop owners at wobbly tables and founders in borrowed conference rooms. Checks came late, wins were quiet, but month by month, the ground under me steadied. I signed my first commercial lease with the kind of pen you keep afterward, the kind that reminds you ink can change a life. I didn't send a family group text about it. I taped the duplicate key behind my vision board and went back to work. Keeping my success to myself wasn't pettiness. It was self-preservation. 2 years earlier, I'd flown home bright with updates and watched them dim under just in case and be realistic and what's plan B if the internet breaks. I stopped pushing boulders uphill with my bare hands and stopped translating a language they didn't want to learn. The only person who got the unfiltered version of my days was Ben, my roommate, with a Nirvana t-shirt under a blazer and an eye for what holds. He never tried to sell me confidence. He just showed up with structure spreadsheets for cash flow, a calendar that breathed a question whenever I needed one. Does this choice honor future you? So, when the dinner invitation arrived, Cardinale 7 o'clock sharp, the kind of place people post for proof, I almost ignored it. But Ben looked at me over a takeout container and said, "Let them meet the person you really are, not the file they keep on you." I booked a haircut, polished. The good shoes slid the lease copy into my wallet like a small private promise. I wasn't going to announce anything. I was going to eat with my back straight and my voice steady. If they asked, I'd answer. If they didn't, I'd leave my worth where it belonged, mine. The restaurant hummed with money performing humility, reclaimed wood that had never known splinters, dim lighting that made every table look like a secret. I arrived on time, a minute early if we're counting, and found them mid-story about bonuses and market swings and the latest baby shower. Hello felt like a test and a courtesy at once. Mia's bracelet winked under the light when she reached for her glass, and my uncle's watch caught my eye the way a warning sign does on a narrow road. We covered weather and parking, and whether the sea bass was worth the surcharge. No one asked about my week. They asked about my workload like you ask a neighbor if their faucet still drips. The waiter's whisper would come later. The first cut was smaller, and it came wrapped as usual like concern. Mia tilted her head with polished kindness and a smile that had trained for this moment. "Taylor," she said, "are you still doing the freelance thing? Or did you find something more settled? Mia's question lingered in the air longer than it deserved, a thin smile tucked beneath her words, like the blade hidden in velvet. She asked if I had finally found something stable, the way a person might ask if a storm had finally ended. My uncle cleared his throat, a sound that carried through the table like a gavel. "There's no shame in admitting when it's time to grow up," he said, swirling his wine as if the reflection held the authority to make judgments. The others chuckled quietly, their forks resting mid-bite, waiting for me to stumble into the answer they already expected. I managed a calm smile, though inside it pressed sharp against my ribs. "I'm still doing my thing," I told them, my voice steadier than my hands beneath the tablecloth. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel in volume, but it carried weight in its ease. They weren't laughing at a joke. They were laughing at me, at the life they thought I was struggling to keep together. My father looked down at his plate as if silence was protection, though I knew it was easier for him to say nothing than to risk standing beside me. The room shifted with that kind of tension only family can create, where smiles are stretched too wide and every question feels like an inspection. Mia leaned back, draping her arm over the chair like a queen amused by her subject. "That's so brave," she said, her tone heavy with mock concern. "I just don't know how you sleep at night without a retirement plan." A chorus of laughter followed again, and it wrapped around me until my pulse pounded in my ears. For them, it was a performance, one more evening of comparing zip codes, titles, and salaries, where I was the one cautionary tale. What they didn't know was that earlier that week, I had signed the lease for my first real office, a space I'd dreamed of since my 20s when I taped magazine cutouts to a vision board and told myself to stay ruthless. My account had more zeros than it ever had before, not by accident, but by long nights and relentless decisions. Yet I sat there letting their words settle over me like dust because I had learned the hard way that my milestones weren't welcome here. They preferred me unfinished, a story they could shake their heads at without ever asking for the truth. Every detail of that dinner etched itself into my mind. The glint of Mia's diamond earrings, the way Uncle Ron set down his glass as if his words were closing arguments, the soft murmur of the waiter filling water glasses as if trying to balance the weight in the room. I thought back to childhood, to birthday parties, where cousins unwrapped gifts wrapped in glossy paper, while I opened a card with polite applause. I thought of school picnics, where my sneakers were noticed not for how fast I ran, but for being the brand no one else wore. That same quiet judgment now stretched across the table, dressed up in adulthood, but unchanged in spirit. I kept my voice even, not because I wasn't hurt, but because I had long ago learned how to protect myself with silence. Yet every sentence they spoke burrowed deeper, stirring that younger version of me who had tried so hard to earn a nod of approval. Their words weren't daggers meant to wound directly. They were needles slipped beneath the skin, each laugh carrying the sting of dismissal. The more they spoke, the clearer it became that I wasn't there to reconnect. I was there to be measured, weighed, and found wanting. Dessert arrived, delicate plates of chocolate tortes and crème brûlées that glittered under the soft light. I barely touched mine, appetite gone beneath the heaviness of the moment. Then the waiter returned, stepping quietly to my side with the same calm presence he had earlier. He leaned close, his voice low enough for only me. "Your driver has arrived, Mrs. Simmers," he said. "Shall I let him know you'll need a few more minutes?" The fork slipped from Mia's hand, clattering faintly against porcelain. Uncle Ron blinked twice, as though the words hadn't been spoken in English. My father's head lifted at last, his eyes narrowing, as if the waiter had mistaken me for someone else. The silence that followed was thick, the kind that no one knows how to break without exposing something unspoken. For a moment, no one moved, every gaze pressing into me like a demand for explanation. I let the pause stretch, steadying myself in that fragile sliver of power. Then I looked at the waiter, nodding once. Tell him I'll be just a little longer. His lips curved into a faint smile. Not the polite one meant for guests, but something knowing, as if he held a piece of the truth none of them had been willing to see. He walked away, and in his absence, the air at the table tightened even more. Mia recovered first, tilting her head with that familiar smirk. A driver, she asked lightly. Don't tell me you've started dating someone rich. Uncle Ron chuckled, though his eyes lingered with unease. I felt every gaze pressing in again, searching for cracks, waiting for me to flinch or explain. But I didn't. I kept my breath even, my posture steady, and let them wonder. For years, they had painted my story without asking me for the brush. That night, for the first time, they saw a color. They hadn't expected one they couldn't name without admitting their assumptions had been wrong. I sat back in my chair, my hand resting calmly on the stem of my glass, and allowed the silence to expand. The real moment wasn't the driver or the waiter's whisper. It was the fracture in their certainty, the recognition that the image they held of me no longer fit. Yet beneath that calm surface, my heart was racing. I could feel the storm rising just below my skin, a mixture of exhaustion and defiance that had been waiting for years to surface. Their confusion wasn't enough, not anymore. I wanted them to see the truth they had ignored, the life they had dismissed as fragile when it had already taken root. I didn't know it yet, but that whisper from the waiter had opened a door I could no longer close. That was when I felt my phone buzz in my pocket, a vibration that carried a weight I didn't yet understand. I reached for it slowly, still keeping my gaze steady at the table. A single message from Ben lit the screen, only 5 words that would turn the evening on its head. Check the news right now. The vibration in my pocket felt louder than the chatter that surrounded me. I glanced down at this message from Ben. 5 words. Check the news right now. I tapped the link, and the headline filled the screen in bold type, the face behind the frequency. Taylor Simmers is redefining community brands. The article was longer than I expected, a full profile with photos of the campaign I had spent months shaping, the one that had gone viral before securing a national grant. My name was in print, not as a footnote, but as the centerpiece. I let the phone rest on the table screen, up the glow casting shadows across the linen. For a moment, no one moved, though I could see their eyes darting toward the words, then away again, as though unwilling to believe what they were reading. Mia leaned forward, first curiosity breaking through her smirk. Her lips parted, but no sound followed. The silence around her carried more weight than anything she might have said. Uncle Ron's hand hovered above his glass, unsure whether to lift it or retreat. Even my father finally raised his eyes, confusion lining his face. I pushed the phone gently toward the center, letting them read what I no longer cared to explain. This is what I've been working on, I said softly. No speech, no defense, just the truth set in black and white. The shift at the table was subtle, but I felt it like a storm front moving through. Mia's pale expression said more than her words ever could. My uncle cleared his throat, the same old sound, but it lacked authority now. Why didn't you tell us? My father asked, his voice low-measured. I wanted to tell him I had countless times. That I had shared updates, sent emails, even sat across from him with stories of progress he never absorbed. I wanted to remind him of every unanswered message, every time his silence had been louder than words. But in that moment, I couldn't find the strength. The truth was simple, they had never believed me. Mia gave a short laugh, brittle at the edges. Well, good for you, Taylor. Who would have thought? the words sliced deeper than any of the laughter earlier. Who would have thought? As if my years of long nights, my steady climb from late invoices to contracts with weight, had been nothing more than a fluke. I stood my chair sliding back against the polished floor, the sound sharp in the quiet. Reaching for my wallet, I laid bills on the table enough to cover my meal. I didn't come here to convince you, I said. I came here to eat. And with that, I turned and walked away. No raised voice, no grand declaration, just the kind of stillness that carries more weight than anger. I could feel their eyes on my back as I crossed the room, each step measured, each breath tight in my chest. The night air was cool when I stepped outside, and the black sedan Ben had arranged waited at the curb. I slid into the back seat, the leather unfamiliar against my skin. My hands trembled as I settled in, and I told the driver to just go anywhere. It didn't matter. The city blurred past the window lights, bending through the streaks of my reflection. I pressed my forehead to the glass, fighting back tears that came in waves. The moment I had imagined standing tall in front of them, proving my worth, did not feel victorious. It felt hollow, heavy, like I had been carrying the hope of their approval longer than I wanted to admit. I whispered into the night, asking why I was never enough, until success forced them to pause. The silence inside the car answered back with the echo of my own doubt. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I asked the driver to drop me a few blocks from Ben's apartment, but I couldn't bring myself to knock. I sat on the curb, hoodie pulled tight around me, watching the rhythm of traffic flow by. My chest felt heavy, my body exhausted, yet my mind replayed every word from the dinner, every smirk and chuckle that had chipped away at me. The days that followed blurred together in muted tones. I left emails, unanswered deadlines, missed clients calling without reply. I told Ben I needed rest, but the truth was simpler and darker. I was unraveling. I spent hours staring at blank screens, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat I couldn't match. At night, I scrolled endlessly through my phone, searching for something to distract from the hollow feeling, yet nothing settled the ache. I remembered once when I had flown home for Thanksgiving with fresh excitement over a client who prepaid $3,000. I had shared the news with pride, only for Uncle Ron to ask if that was before taxes. Mia had smirked, wondering aloud what I'd do if the internet broke. Their words had turned that victory into ash before it even left my hands. That was the pattern. Every moment of joy met with questions that drained it of its meaning. I had learned to keep quiet, to hold my milestones close, because sharing only invited dismissal. Now in the quiet after the dinner, I felt the weight of all those years pressing harder than ever. The article in the news should have been validation, a moment to celebrate. Instead, it amplified the absence of something I had long craved and never received, their genuine belief. The victory was real, yet it rang hollow without the echo of recognition from those who should have cared first. I spiraled deeper into doubt. Was I truly building something lasting, or was it all fragile, waiting to collapse? Had they been right all along that my work was a brave experiment and nothing more? Grief and anger circled each other inside me, neither giving way to peace. I felt tired in my bones, tired in the way that no sleep could repair. One night, Ben showed up uninvited, stepping into the silence of my apartment. I sat on the floor, a box of dry cereal beside me, staring blankly at the wall. He didn't ask questions, didn't press. He just sat down across from me, his presence steady and unyielding. "Build for those who clap with their whole soul," he said quietly. "Not for the ones who wait for proof." His words didn't fix everything, but they planted something small in the rubble, a reminder that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't building for the wrong crowd after all. Still, the days stretched long and heavy. I let messages pile up, convinced I had nothing left to give. The driver's leather seat, the article's headline, even my calm exit from the restaurant, each image replayed like a loop not of triumph, but of loneliness. Success without recognition from family felt like standing on a stage in an empty theater, the lights hot, the silence heavier than applause. I knew something had to give, though I couldn't yet see what. The whispers of exhaustion grew louder, the weight of years of dismissal pulling me down. And though Ben's words had sparked a flicker, the darkness around me felt unbroken. I didn't realize then that the breaking had only just begun, and that the weeks ahead would push me further before I could find my footing again. Nights blurred together in that quiet apartment, where the glow of my laptop became less a tool and more a mirror reflecting the weight I couldn't shake. The cursor blinked back at me, daring me to type, while my mind replayed the dinner again and again. I told myself I was resting, but the truth was simpler. I was collapsing under years of voices that had never believed in me. Every smile from that table lingered like a bruise, every laugh echoing long after the plates were cleared. I tried distractions. I went out a few nights, sat on bar stools with strangers, scrolled endlessly through my phone, even downloaded a dating app just to feel like someone saw me. But each attempt ended the same, with me walking home in silence, emptier than when I started. Once I stumbled onto an open mic and tried to joke about branding, about logos and late payments. People laughed, but not with me. I left early, the sting of their amusement pressing against the hollow part of me that feared my family had been right all along. Therapy seemed like a possibility, so I scheduled a session. The woman across from me had kind eyes and listened carefully as I explained the silence after my wins, the emptiness I carried. "When's the last time you felt proud of yourself?" she asked. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came. I remembered moments that should have been enough. Contracts signed, clients praising me, an office lease inked in black and white, but they all felt distant, stripped of meaning because no one I loved had believed in them. She said I was carrying voices that didn't belong to me, that I had internalized their invalidation. Her words sounded clear in that quiet office, but outside, they dissolved into noise. One evening, I walked into the new office I had fought to secure. The walls still smelled of fresh paint, the windows overlooked the city, and the echo of my footsteps should have felt like possibility. Instead, I sat on the bare floor, my knees pulled in whispering apologies to a version of myself I couldn't forgive. I didn't even know who I was apologizing to. Maybe the younger me who kept trying, maybe the dreamer who once thought approval would follow effort. A spark of hope came unexpectedly. An old client reached out, offering me the chance to lead a new project with a 5-figure retainer. It should have been everything I needed. I poured myself into the work, sketching ideas until dawn, pitching concepts on Zoom, with my voice steady and clear. When the client clapped, when they said they were thrilled, tears welled in my eyes, gratitude mixing with disbelief. For the first time in weeks, I felt alive again, reminded of the fire that had built all of this. But by Monday morning, it unraveled. An email arrived from their new investor, explaining they had chosen to bring the work in-house. No warning, no payout, just a short message ending with a line that stung. "It's only business." Days later, I saw their rebrand launch online, my exact tagline plastered across their campaign. They hadn't just walked away, they had stolen the words I bled for. I felt anger rise hot in my chest, then collapse into despair. That night, I smashed a glass on my kitchen counter, the sound sharp, immediate, a release of something I couldn't name. Within seconds, I was crouched on the floor, sweeping shards into a dustpan, with shaking hands, terrified of what I had become. I looked at my reflection in the window, hollow eyes, a jaw set too tight, a mouth that barely knew how to smile anymore. The next morning, I did something I never thought I would. I sent Ben a message, only 2 words, "Help me." He arrived 20 minutes later with breakfast sandwiches and an old hoodie I had left at his place years ago. He didn't ask questions. He sat on my couch, turned on quiet music, and simply said, "We'll build from here." His presence steadied me in ways no speech ever could. It was Ben who reminded me that healing wasn't about grand gestures, but about small choices stacked together until they formed something new. He drove me one evening to the canal outside the city. We sat in silence, watching the water reflect the streetlights. Finally, he spoke. "You don't need their approval," he said, "but you do need to forgive them. Otherwise, this pain will own you." His words sank deep, not as a command, but as an invitation. That night, I went home and made a list not of goals, but of goodbyes. Goodbye to needing my father's praise, to waiting for Mia's respect, to explaining my path to people unwilling to understand it. Goodbye to shrinking myself so others wouldn't feel small. At the bottom, I wrote the hardest line goodbye to the dream of being accepted by the people who raised me. I folded the paper, lit a match, and watched the flame reduce it to ash in the sink. The smoke curled upward like a prayer, fragile but final. Something shifted in me that night. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. For the first time in months, I woke early by choice brewed fresh coffee, lit a candle, and opened a notebook not to prove anything, but to listen to myself. I wrote one line across the page. "Today I will not betray myself." Each morning afterward began with that same sentence. It became a rhythm, a reminder that my worth was not theirs to measure. Ben and I began talking about what had always lived between us, the dream of building together. We formed Kind Frequency, a studio rooted not in chasing the biggest contracts, but in aligning with people whose missions carried heart. Our first clients weren't glamorous, but they mattered: a wellness brand run by single mothers, a nonprofit teaching teens how to code a family-owned bakery whose daughter had once drawn their logo in crayons. Every meeting left me lighter, every handshake steadier. The office that once felt hollow grew into something alive. Plants lined the windowsills, vinyl records played while we worked, and clients lingered long after meetings, eager to talk, not just about branding, but about life. It wasn't loud success, but it was true. And for the first time, that was enough. Yet even in the warmth of this new rhythm, the memory of that dinner never fully left me. It hovered at the edges, a reminder of the wound that had cracked me open. I was stronger now, steadier, but I knew the story with my family wasn't finished. Somewhere down the road, the paths we walked would cross again. And when they did, I promised myself I would not be the same person who left that restaurant with shaking hands. I would be the one who built a life they could no longer ignore. The mornings became my anchor. I rose early, brewed coffee strong enough to cut through the heaviness, and wrote the same line at the top of every page. "Today, I will not betray myself." It steadied me in a way applause never had. I filled the hours with small, deliberate choices: watering plants, cooking real meals, taking walks without my phone. They weren't grand victories, but they felt like stitching torn fabric, one careful thread at a time. Ben and I leaned into the vision we had carried for years. Kind Frequency took shape slowly but with purpose, its walls painted with more than color, painted with the intention of building something that would outlast doubt. We signed our first aligned clients, and each project reminded me that the work itself was enough when it was rooted in connection. The energy in our office shifted. The air no longer echoed with loneliness, but hummed with ideas, laughter, and the satisfaction of creating without compromise. As the weeks passed, I noticed my reflection changing. My eyes seemed clearer, my shoulders less burdened. I bought clothes that didn't just cover me, but expressed me pieces that made me feel whole when I walked into a room. Therapy helped me untangle the voices I had carried for so long, and I set firmer boundaries. I muted the family group chat where promotions and purchases were paraded like trophies. I no longer opened messages that only left me feeling smaller. For the first time in my adult life, my peace wasn't up for negotiation. Ben watched the shift quietly, and one evening while we packed up late at the office, he said, "You're building from wholeness now, not hunger." His words landed softly, a truth I hadn't noticed but immediately recognized. I smiled not to deflect, but because I finally felt the difference. My work wasn't fueled by the ache to be seen by those who never looked closely. It was driven by a steady fire inside me. It was during this season that I met Arya. She spoke at a small branding conference downtown, her talk weaving storytelling into strategy with a grace that held the room. I introduced myself afterward, expecting nothing but her smile carried warmth without effort. "I know who you are," she said. "Your work with Ripple Books was brilliant." Those words reached me differently than any headline or client review ever had. They weren't impressed by numbers or contracts, they were grounded in recognition of the craft itself. Our connection grew quietly. First coffee, then long walks, then evenings where conversations stretched past midnight. She didn't ask what I earned or what name appeared on my client list. She asked what healed me, what scared me, what I wanted to build 10 years from now that had nothing to do with revenue. With her, I didn't need to explain myself or defend my choices. She saw me, and for the first time, I allowed myself to be seen without armor. Life became steady, not spectacular, but deeply alive. Evenings were filled with music spilling from old speakers, sunlight poured through windows during client meetings, and laughter softened the weight of long days. The wound from that dinner was still there, but it no longer dictated the rhythm of my life. It had become part of the landscape, not the defining feature. But peace does not erase the past. It only teaches you to hold it differently. One afternoon, as Ben and I reviewed new inquiries, an email appeared that pulled me back into the world I thought I had left behind. The subject line read, "Potential Brand Alignment, Simmer's Family Estate." At first, I thought it was a mistake, but when I opened it, the names were unmistakable. My Uncle Ron and Mia, along with her fiancé Travis, had invested in a new wine label. They wanted a sleek rebrand for national distribution, and somehow my name had reached their radar. I stared at the screen for a long time, torn between disbelief and the irony of it. The same family who once laughed at my career now sought my expertise. I laughed softly more at the timing than the request itself. Ben leaned over my shoulder, raising an eyebrow. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, though the weight of the moment pressed deep. "Just ironic," I said, closing the email. I didn't reply immediately. I let the message sit unopened after that first read, as if ignoring it could delay the inevitable. But curiosity simmered underneath. Even after all the years of dismissal, the scars from their words, and the silence after my victories, some part of me wanted to walk back into that room, not for revenge, but for revelation. Not to show them who I had become, but to stand in the truth of who I had always been. The idea of facing them again stirred old emotions. Memories of childhood moments came rushing back, the sneakers that never fit their standards, the birthdays marked with polite nods instead of celebrations, the steady sense of being measured and found lacking. Those wounds had carved themselves deep, but I was no longer that child or the young adult grasping for scraps of approval. I was someone who had built a life from the ground up, a life that no one could take credit for but me. Still, I knew walking into their project wouldn't be simple. Old dynamics have a way of resurfacing, and I could already imagine the glances, the smirks, the subtle ways they would try to reduce me. But this time, I was different. I didn't need their applause. I didn't need their permission. What I carried now was something stronger than their dismissal, self-respect, born from silence, boundaries, drawn in permanence, and a vision bigger than their opinions. Ben looked at me across the table as I sat lost in thought. "If you're going to take this meeting," he said, "make sure you go as yourself, not as who they expect you to be." His words settled into me like stone, grounding me in what mattered most. I wasn't walking back into their world to be seen by them. I was walking in to see myself reflected in the person I had become. That night, I lay awake longer than I expected, listening to the quiet of my apartment. The decision hadn't been made, but I could feel it forming. The past and present were circling each other, and I knew they would meet soon. When they did, I wouldn't arrive shaking or small. I would arrive steady, composed, carrying the life I had built with my own 2 hands. The rain had started early that morning, a steady rhythm against the windows that made the world feel heavier, but also more certain. By the time I pulled into the vineyard's parking lot, the sky was a wash of gray soft, but unrelenting. The tasting room stood at the center of the property, all reclaimed wood and polished stone, designed to look rustic, but costing more than most homes. I stepped out of the car with an umbrella in hand, every movement deliberate. Today wasn't about pretending to fit in. Today was about walking in as myself. Ben was already inside, seated at the far end of the long oak table with his laptop open. He glanced up when I entered, giving me a small nod that was steady and grounding. I chose my seat, carefully setting my notebook down with quiet assurance. Across from us sat Mia, Uncle Ron, and Travis, her fiancé. Their laughter fading as they realized who had arrived to hear their pitch. The silence that followed wasn't hostile, but it carried weight and unspoken recognition that the balance of power had shifted. Taylor, Mia said finally, her tone clipped. She blinked quickly, adjusting the sleeve of her blazer as though it could anchor her. Uncle Ron squinted clearly, working to connect the dots. "Wait," he said slowly, "you're the one behind Kind Frequency." Ben looked up calm as ever and answered before I could. "Co-founded," he said. "Taylor built it." The words landed with finality, leaving them no room to diminish the truth. They launched into their presentation speaking of heritage, elegance, generational storytelling phrases meant to impress investors and consumers alike. I listened, my hands folded loosely on the table, not interrupting, not reacting. They filled the air with buzzwords, but what I noticed most was their discomfort. Their eyes kept darting between me and their notes, as if unsure how to reconcile the person in front of them with the image they had carried for years. When they finished, Mia leaned back, arms crossed, the hint of challenge in her posture. "So," she said, "what do you think?" Her tone was measured, but I heard the edge underneath. I glanced at Ben, who gave the smallest nod, reminding me without words that this moment belonged to me. I leaned forward, speaking slowly, each word deliberate. "I think what you're building could be beautiful if you believed in it the way you pretended not to believe in me." The room stilled. Mia's expression faltered, her mouth opening slightly before closing again. Uncle Ron shifted in his chair, clearing his throat in that familiar way. But the sound carried no weight this time. The truth hung between us, undeniable, quiet, and sharp. "I'm not upset," I continued softly before he could speak. "This isn't about resentment. It's about resonance." My words landed in the silence, and for once they had no rehearsed response. I reached into my bag and pulled out the pitch deck Ben and I had worked on. We had prepared it fully, even knowing who the client was, because some work deserved to be completed regardless of who received it. I slid it across the table toward them. No contract, I said. No fee. Consider it a gift from the version of me you never made space for. The room shifted again, but this time it wasn't discomfort. It was something deeper, an awareness that they had been given something they could never return. Mia's fingers touched the edge of the deck, but didn't open it. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than before. "You're really not going to take the project?" she asked. I shook my head gently. For me, this was the project. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then I saw something change in Mia's face, the way light shifts across a mirror. Regret, reflection, maybe both, as if she was seeing not only me, but herself in a new light. Uncle Ron looked down, fumbling with his collar, his authority gone. Travis remained silent, glancing between them, as though waiting for permission to move. Ben closed his laptop and stood his movements unhurried. I rose as well, gathering my things without rush. The rain continued outside, steady and soft like punctuation at the end of a sentence. As I turned to leave, Uncle Ron called my name. "Taylor," he said, his voice lower than I'd ever heard it. I paused, but didn't turn. "We were wrong," he admitted. "I see that now." I nodded once, not for him, but for myself, and kept walking. There was no satisfaction in the silence that followed me out, only clarity. Closure wasn't in their apology. It was in my presence in standing there, without needing anything more. As the glass doors closed behind me, the rain tapped gently against my umbrella, and for the first time in years, I felt free. But freedom doesn't erase the past. It only clears the space for what comes next. And as Ben and I walked back to the car, neither of us spoke because we both knew something had shifted permanently. The confrontation had ended, but the ripple of it was only beginning. The rain followed us back to the city, quiet drops tracing their way down the car windows, as though the storm itself hadn't yet finished speaking. Ben drove in silence, his hands steady on the wheel, while I leaned back and let the moment replay in my mind. The vineyard felt far away already, like a stage I had just stepped off. Only this time, I wasn't the performer desperate for applause. I was the one who chose when the curtain fell. In the weeks after that meeting, nothing came from Mia or Uncle Ron. No follow-up emails, no contracts, no apologies. The pitch deck I had given them remained unacknowledged, though I knew they had read it. Silence became their only reply, and oddly enough, I welcomed it. For years, I had ached for their words, but now I understood that absence carried its own truth. They had to live with what they saw that day, and that was enough. Meanwhile, my life kept moving forward. Kind frequency thrived in ways that felt both steady and unexpected. We signed clients whose values matched our own, and the work filled me with a quiet pride I hadn't felt in years. Our office grew warmer with each passing week, plants thriving in the light records, humming softly while we worked late into the evening. Clients lingered not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. It was a kind of success that couldn't be measured in the numbers my family worshipped. It lived in presence, in purpose, in the way each project reminded me why I had started at all. Arya became more than a spark in those months. She was steady in ways I hadn't realized I needed. We shared mornings on the fire escape with tea in hand, watching the city wake up speaking about everything and nothing. She never asked for proof of my worth. She simply saw it. Being with her softened something in me, a reminder that intimacy wasn't performance. It was presence, acceptance, and laughter that came easily. But even as new chapters opened, I kept a drawer in my apartment filled with unsent letters. One was for Mia, another for my father, another for the younger version of myself who had waited by the phone for approval that never came. They weren't angry letters, they were honest ones. I wrote them on nights when old memories surfaced, when silence carried more sting than comfort. Sometimes I opened the drawer just to read a line or two, not to reopen the wound, but to honor the scar. There was one letter that mattered most. I had written it to myself the night after the vineyard meeting. I found it again weeks later, tucked inside a notebook filled with half-sketched ideas. The words stopped me. Dear Taylor, you didn't need the room to clap. You needed to remember you built the room. I read that line 3 times before closing my eyes and breathing deep. For years, I had lived as though their applause was the measure of my worth. But now I understood the truth. I had built the stage, the lights, the entire theater. They were just guests who never recognized where they stood. That realization changed the way I carried myself. When self-doubt knocked, I could tell the difference between discomfort and disrespect. When clients pushed boundaries, I drew lines without guilt. When friends offered support, I received it without suspicion. My life wasn't louder, but it was clearer, and that clarity was worth more than any applause I had once begged for. Occasionally, I still passed places that reminded me of who I had been. The old apartment, the coffee shop where I met early clients, the park bench where Ben and I once scribbled strategies on the back of a pizza box. I didn't avoid them. I walked past, slowly nodding at those chapters with gratitude rather than regret. They had held me when nothing else did, and they had shaped the person who now walked forward with steadier steps. One evening, Arya and I sat together, legs tangled under a blanket, steam rising from our cups. She looked at me quietly for a long moment before asking, "Do you think you'll ever reach out to them again?" Her question carried no pressure, only curiosity. I thought about it, really thought, letting the silence stretch before I answered. "I think I already did," I said softly, just not with words. She nodded, understanding without me needing to explain. Because sometimes forgiveness isn't spoken. It's lived in the way you no longer flinch in the boundaries you no longer apologize for, in the laughter that returns after years of silence. Months passed, and still nothing came from my family. No acknowledgement of the meeting, no attempt to bridge the space that had grown between us. And strangely, that became its own kind of justice. Their silence, once heavy, now revealed itself as consequence. They had to live with the reflection I left them, a truth they couldn't escape. Meanwhile, I had moved forward. Justice didn't arrive in headlines or contracts. It arrived in the balance of my own life, in the way their dismissal no longer dictated my worth, in the way I no longer bent under the weight of their expectations. Their world had cracked whether they admitted it or not, and mine had become whole. That was enough. Yet even in that peace, I knew one step remained. Closure is rarely found in grand gestures. It's discovered in the quiet moments when you realize the story has shifted permanently. I had walked out of their meeting whole, but I hadn't yet spoken the final words to myself. I needed to, and that understanding carried me gently toward what would become the last chapter of this long, painful, and necessary journey. The seasons shifted quietly after the vineyard meeting, and with them, the rhythm of my life. 6 months passed without a word from me, Uncle Ron, or even my father. Their silence had once been a wound, but now it was a boundary I hadn't needed to draw myself. The absence was telling enough, and for the first time in years, I no longer felt the urge to chase it. Justice had arrived not in confrontation, but in the way their world bent under truth they couldn't deny. kind frequency grew in that silence. Ben and I moved the studio into a converted brick loft with tall windows and wooden floors that creaked with every step. We filled it with plants that thrived in sunlight shelves, stacked with notebooks and music that softened even the hardest days. Our clients weren't trophies, they were people with vision stories worth telling, and the courage to build something lasting. Work became less about proving myself and more about creating from a place of peace. Arya became part of that rhythm too. We spent evenings on the fire escape, wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea and watching the city shift from day into night. She never asked me to explain the past, but she understood when it surfaced in small ways: a quiet sigh, an old habit of second-guessing myself. Her presence was a reminder that love doesn't demand performance. It simply stays steady and sure until you believe it. At home, I kept a drawer of letters I never sent. One was for Mia, another for my father, another for the younger me, who once waited by the phone hoping for someone to ask how the pitch went. Those letters were not angry. They were simply honest. When I read them now, they feel less like confessions and more like mile markers, proof of the distance I've traveled. They remind me that closure doesn't always arrive with apologies. It often comes from choosing your own ending. The truest closure came one evening when I found the note I had written to myself after the vineyard meeting. You didn't need the room to clap. You needed to remember you built the room. I read it aloud 3 times, each word settling deeper than before. In that moment, I knew I no longer carried the weight of needing to be seen by people who refused to look. The applause I once longed for had lost its hold because the life I built was never meant to be theirs to validate. Justice, I realized, is not always about watching someone fall. Sometimes it's about standing tall without them knowing they can no longer touch the ground you've claimed as your own. Their dismissal no longer haunted me. It humbled them, and my dignity was restored, not through their change of heart, but through my decision to no longer hand them the pen that wrote my worth. Life now is quieter, but richer. I walk more through parks, where children laugh freely down the streets, where the air smells of bread baking past the old apartment that once held all my doubt. I nod at it in passing, not with bitterness, but with reverence. That space sheltered me while I built the foundation of who I am. Now I carry myself, and that is enough. I don't fight for a seat at tables where I was never welcome. I build my own longer, warmer, filled with people who see me as I am, not as they imagined me. And the lesson I carry, the one I hope never to forget, is that dignity isn't given. It's reclaimed quietly and firmly in the way you rise after being underestimated, in the way you choose peace over performance. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most deeply to you. Share your thoughts if you'd like, and if stories of family resilience and quiet justice resonate with you, stay connected here.